Okay, welcome back. And now, as they say, for something completely different, I think, in terms of the patenting issue and the complexities surrounding that. To talk about that, we have AURORA PLOMER from Sheffield University, who's doing a joint presentation with Peter Taylor from Oxford University, and their topic is patently, or I suppose it's patently complex, isn't it? Emerging questions on patents on biotechnology inventions. Aurora.
Okay, Brian, thank you very much. And thank you as well to Eve and indeed the organizers of this conference for giving us the opportunity to share our thoughts with you here today. I must say, for me, it's been an interesting journey. I didn't know anything about complexity theory when I agreed to talk on this topic. I have learned a lot from Peter Taylor here. I think it's actually been a real privilege for me to be able to share thoughts with him. And I think what we've produced, in fact, even though it is a working draft, and of course everyone says, we prefaces all these presentations with these words of warning. I think what we have come up with certainly is interesting, it's novel, and it hopefully will bring some new light on what are very complex issues and very serious issues which are currently facing the patent system. So our aim here today is to identify systemic weaknesses in the biotechnology patent system, to highlight similarities to financial markets and what this might mean for the patent system, and to outline key areas for reform. And in order to achieve this, we were partly guided by these words, which some of you, I'm sure, here will know at the LSE, which say we're faced at every turn with the problems of organic unity, of discreteness, of discontinuity. The whole is not equal to the sum of the parts. Comparisons of quantity fail us. Small changes produce large effects. And the assumptions of a uniform and homogeneous continuum are not satisfied. Of course, these words, they do not come from, they were not uttered by a geneticist, but they were the words of John Maynard Keynes, in this instance cited in a book to which we will refer later. It's a very kind of appropriate guiding thought to our talk. What we're going to do is go through patent basics. I was told I shouldn't assume, or we shouldn't assume that you necessarily knew what a patent was. Then go on to draw some parallel structural weaknesses, as we see it, between financial markets and the patent system and its application to biotechnology. And in particular, we've homed in on three structural weaknesses, transparency, complexity, and regulatory infrastructure. We'll then synthesize what, our thoughts, look at whether the system is heading towards failure, and suggest some key points for reform. And Peter and I will take it in turns to outline these points as we go through the presentation. Now, to begin with, what is a patent? A patent may be defined as a grant by the state of exclusive rights for a limited time in respect of a new and useful invention. The patent confers an exclusionary right to prevent others from using the invention without the patentee's authorization. It's a negative right. So the patent holder can stop others using the invention unless they agree to the terms that he or she wants to set. And then, obviously, patents can be enforced through the courts, and those who use the patent without the patentee's authorization may be ordered to stop the activities and to pay damages, very substantial, as we will see. What is patentable? Well, in this field, the human body, at the various stages of its development, and the simple discovery of its element, is not patentable in its natural state, but an element isolated from the human body or otherwise produced by means of a technical process is patentable. And this is the legal position, and it has been clarified ever since the adoption of the EU directive in 1998, which has been implemented in UK law. So where this takes us is that whereas there has been considerable debate ever since patents on DNA began to be issued as to whether those patents were really valid or not, whether what was being covered by the patent was indeed, an invention as opposed to a discovery, and certainly, whether these inventions, how these inventions mapped onto traditional understandings of an invention. The position now is legally very clear that isolated elements from the human body are just as patentable as the steam engine. In order to be able to secure a patent, though, the applicant has to establish that these elements fulfill all these criteria: novelty, inventive step, and industrial application. In the United States, inventive step is known as obviousness, industrial application, utility. Essentially, we've got the same threefold criteria that have to be satisfied in order for these applications to be patentable. And of course, you can imagine or anticipate that many of the difficulties which have arisen in this field relate to the interpretation and application of these criteria to new technologies. That's where the crux of the matter has been. Now, we'll go through, where, the nature of the problems that, this criteria have generated in more detail. But before we do so, something important to note is that the patent system is intended to strike a balance between the interests of the patent holder and those of society at large. In a sense, it's a kind of social contract between society and the inventor, whereby the inventor is given an exclusive monopoly over the invention in return for disclosing details of the invention, making them available to the public, so that, as you find in various quotes, including the Gower report, which recently reported on the state of intellectual property in the UK, others can stand on the shoulders of giants, and society as a whole benefit from the invention by building on this knowledge, taking it further and innovating this on its basis. So publication disclosure is absolutely crucial to the economic rationale of a patent system. Now, the paradox here lies in that despite this publication element being absolutely necessary to the whole system, to the economic rationale of the system, there has been, in the UK, a very clear knowledge transfer failure in relation to the existence of foundational patents on human embryonic stem cells, which were granted, some of them were granted to the US company Geron back in 2005, and as Ben Sykes here from the UK National Stem Cell Network can confirm, were actually the existence of which were largely unknown to the scientific community until the publication of an article which I co-authored with some colleagues in the United States back in January 2008, and a subsequent workshop that took place in Edinburgh. Now, the implications of this, as you can imagine, are actually quite serious, because there are many scientists currently in the UK which are essentially potentially infringing this patent. Now, not only was the existence of this patent not known to scientists 3 years after its grant, but it was very difficult to access details of the claims on the public databases, on ESPASnet, which is where you would find them. And it is so difficult, in fact, that some of the universities here in the UK, and I won't mention names, but this is true, absolutely true, who were alerted by their scientists to the existence of the patents, The knowledge transfer units went away, looked at the databases, and came back and said, you're mistaken, don't worry, the patent hasn't been granted. So 3 years after the existence, and after the patent is granted, people don't know about it, who should know about it, and the universities, knowledge transfer offices can't even find the claims on the databases. And in a way, it's actually this kind of conundrum which has taken me further into, it's just made me want to work further onto finding out what it is that is going wrong, with the whole system. Here's the front page of the Geron cardiomyocyte patent. You've got copies of it, photocopies of it in your folders. You will notice that the original, it claims a priority date from 2001, and that means that rights as granted were acquired, backdated to 2001. Geron filed in 2002 with the UK IPO. They secured the grant of the patent in 2005. And I will tell you more about this, the fate of this application in the US later on. And if I forget, please remind me, because it's very relevant to the way the whole system is working at an international level. So what we have here in the UK is, if you then perform a search, and I will tell you more about the difficulties in identifying what in fact is happening in this field on embryonic stem cells, a very large share of patents which are being held by US residents, not UK residents. In fact, UK residents are in the minority here. And Geron holds, not only holds the major share, but also holds patents on some of these key technologies, absolutely key, the foundational ones, the AHSC derivatives from which everything else further down the line will be built. So then, that then raises the question of the transparency of this system. How come the system is functioning in a way which is essentially very opaque, because there is the quality of the information available is extremely poor. There is a very substantial information lag in the public databases on patents. Very substantial. It's acknowledged, for instance, in the UK IPO latest report on genomic medicine, which was produced for the House of Lords committee, which is looking into this field, only in April 2008. The UK IPO notes, in its report, that the data which it has generated, and just think about this, the data relates to applications for patents, not grants yet, and that data has a 2-year time lag potentially, right? So we get a report, which is got a date of 2008, which relates to applications back to 2005, which may be 2 years out of date, and the report obviously says nothing about the grants. So we're talking here about a time lag between applications and grants, an upload of potentially 5-6 years, by the time the full information is into the system. And if you think about it, those of you who know a bit about the stem cell field will know that Jamie Thompson, secured the patent on, or WRF, the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation did, on human embryonic stem cells in 2001. And of course, it's barely 6 to 7 years later that Yamanaka produced the IPS, cells, in kind of published, the article on IPS cells. Time moves incredibly fast in this field. There are very, very important changes that can take place within the space of just a few years. And as the information database currently is on the public, in the public databases, it's just simply impossible to actually gather accurate, up-to-date information in Europe, And that applies not to Europe as an entity, but the UK, because the UK database is linked to the European database. It's the European Patent Office which controls the database. Now, even if we had, kind of up-to-date database there, you would find, if you go into Espacnet, as indeed my scientist colleagues have found, that it is a complete nightmare to use. it's an old-fashioned database which has very, very serious limitations on the types of searches you can conduct. In particular, you're restricted to searching on the titles. Now, you can imagine the title of a patent exactly is extremely uninformative, utterly, completely uninformative methods of deriving or identifying or whatever proteins, completely generic. The Yamanaka patent, which is on induced pluripotent stem cells, the title of that patent is nuclear reprogramming factor. There is no mention to stem cells, no mentions to pluripotent, no mentions to induced. None of the words that you would normally think of are in the title. It is impossible to search the abstract, and yet, the abstracts are, in fact, the database which is being used by the UK IPO in developing its patent analytics or informatics landscapes. You just need to be able to search an abstract. At the minimum, you cannot search the abstract in ESPACEnet. And if you try and get hold of the claims, as I said before, yes, they are somewhere hidden in the system. Not intentionally hidden, I think, but I can assure you some of my colleagues think they are. Certainly the head of molecular biology at Sheffield University thinks there is a conspiracy, that the claims, the whole system has been designed to conceal and hide. But the claims, which are absolutely crucial, to the determination of the scope of the patents, you need to be able to see what it is that the applicant has applied for and been granted. Those are extremely difficult to find in the database. Essentially, you need to have technical understanding of the patent system, where the application originated, whether it was an international or a regional application to begin with, and just find your way back into the loop, to access those claims. And I should say, maybe I should add, and I shouldn't add this, but I will. Not even the UK Intellectual Property Office examiners themselves could find their way into that system. So that when I found myself, just before we published the article in Cell Stem Cell, trying to track some of these claims and was unable to, and I rang the UK IPO, they just couldn't find them either. So they just went into their own database, printed them out, and sent them to me. That's how it went. This is how bad things are. Very, very bad. And finally, there are two methods really of searching for these patents. One of them is a semantic search, so you put keywords. That's really very limiting for all kinds of reasons. Peter can go into the science later. The alternative, and this is another method that's being used in all these reports on patents activity that there are, is to use the international classification codes. Now this, or the European one, which is built on the IPC. The International Classification Code was originally devised by WIPO back in the 70s with the aim of assisting in the search of what are, absolutely millions of patents. It's built on 8 bands, and I won't go into, the kind of details of the bands. I have no idea what the rationale is, by the way, although I think it'd be very interesting to find out what the history behind it is. But what I can tell you is that stem cells are classified in C12, and that's in the category which includes wine, spirits, and vinegar, along with stem cells. So the actual mapping of the science to the classification isn't exactly immediately obvious to scientists in the field at any rate. And yet, on this backbone structure of 8 bands, there are built 70,000 sub-classifications, which are intended to capture, the evolving state of the science. So, this is, to me, a very, interesting area potentially one could look into. So, what is the impact of this absolutely extraordinary kind of lack of transparency in the system? Well, clearly, the lack of transparency, contrary to, the whole rationale of the system, suppresses rather than promotes knowledge transfer. It puts researchers unknowingly and others unknowingly at risk of being sued for infringing the patent. Not only that, but of course, if you don't know that there is a patent, on cardiomyocytes held by Geron, you won't do anything to avoid it either. So everyone is busily beavering away, or was until last January, in various departments around the country, working within the patent with no idea that this was happening. Of course, Geron hadn't yet published on their website that they held a patent either. So this is, what the implications are. And of course, there's huge duplication of efforts potentially and economic inefficiency. Now then, Peter, we'll talk about the parallels to financial markets.
I want to explain my background. It's sort of 30 years ago I did quantum theory and mathematical physics, and then I spent the last 30 years in the insurance market in London. So my background is actually in financial markets, and I'm now at the Future of Humanity Institute looking at risk. In that time, I've actually looked at quite a lot of quantitative stuff because I used to run a team of analysts. So I've got a sort of element of the real-world trading problem, which I'm going to try and draw parallels to, but also some basic idea of the science, and particularly this thing called complexity science. Now, this particular mess that AURORA's mentioned, the informatics mess, is quite crucial to markets, and I'm sure it's stating the bleeding obvious to say if you have poor information, then you can have potential market failures. And I think one of the things we'd like to draw out of the analysis of the patent system today is because essentially the complex nature of the things that are being patented, then there is a knock-on effect to the system itself, and that then causes potential systemic failure. Now, it is topical at the moment to talk about systemic failure because financial markets, as you know, around the world have collapsed. This is banking, the banking markets. In the 1980s, we had very similar failures in the London insurance market. We had a spiraling of derivative products in the same way that you've seen securitization derivatives with their underwritten derivatives as well, creating this enormous bubble that has crashed. I'd like to just mention a couple of books, I think, before I go too much further. One is one I'll refer to throughout, a very interesting book, if you're interested, by a man called Didier Sornet, who's professor of entrepreneurial risk at ETH. And this is an analysis done way before the current market crash of what he sees as causing and giving rise to financial market failure. Now, Didier is actually a geophysicist originally, and he's done an enormous amount of work on complex systems, and he is a great believer in the analytical method and what can be systematized. And there is some good evidence, I think, to say that we can understand these systems. I'll explain to you a bit later on as how I understand them and why they aren't like normal systems, and that's why I asked the question I asked, and I'll try and explain it now. But this is an extremely good book if you're interested in financial markets. The other one we're going to look at, of course, is the underlying problem of the genome, the expression of genes. And I'm a card-carrying reductionist, or I was. I've even got a quote, somewhere from, Paul Dirac. Anyone heard of Paul Dirac? Some might have heard of Paul Dirac. Nobel Prize-winning or positron definer. Anyhow, he did quantum theory in the 1920s, and he explained that in discovering quantum theory, a large part of physics, the whole of chemistry, had been solved, and all its applications, by the way, had been solved in principle. It's just the maths is a bit complex. Well, actually, the maths is a bit complex, but actually it isn't solved in principle. He was wrong. It turns out he was wrong. Reductionism doesn't work. Now, what this book by Dennis Noble points out is that the presumption we've had of what you might call the gene 4, or the idea of the book of life, the DNA, the human genome, therefore we know about the RNA, therefore we know about the proteins, therefore we know, it'll give you blue eyes, therefore, that causal chain actually isn't right. It's fundamentally the wrong way to look at this problem. And I think what we're trying to say here is when you're patenting things, you have to look at the characteristics of the things you're patenting. If they are fundamentally human constructs like engineering, then they are actually constructed to operate in a causal manner. If they are of this nature, they may be. I'm not saying they won't be, because obviously pharmaceuticals works. We know that if you put, a certain gene into tomatoes, they produce a luscious red colour. Or orange colour and look like pineapples. I don't know, you know. So we have some evidence that there's some way we can make connections between, you know, the genetics and the function and the characteristics, the phenomes that they generate. But in general, his claim, and I think he's absolutely right, and I'll try and argue that, is that these systems are not of a predictable nature. They may not even be of an explanatory nature. Now, when you're faced with that, unlike Didier, who believes, hopefully he thinks, he'll be able to explain everything, I think it may be true, but it may not be. Now, this problem that we're looking at is to do with information in patents. When you have very poor information, or you get very big time lags in financial markets, they don't work. They seize up. And there are some very simple reasons why they seize up, and it is the bleeding obvious, of course. One is that price becomes separated from value. So what happens is human behavior travels along a course where it creates bubbles of believed asset values, like tulips, and then, you know, it all goes pear-shaped. And we're not inviolate to that. We had the dot-com boom. And guess what actually went with the dot-com boom? Do you remember? The biotech boom. They collapsed with the dot-com companies. So actually, we've already got evidence in front of our very eyes of the very subject matter we're talking about. But anyhow, when prices come separated from value, bubbles form. One of the things about markets, and I think it's true in human behavior generally, and it might well be true in your research community, is that confidence is important. Now, we call it liquidity because it's the trading, it's the movement of the buying and selling. In a way, in research, you're trading information. If you haven't got that information, then you become illiquid. And this sounds to me like you've got a major liquidity problem. And that, in turn, behaviorally suppresses innovation. And then you start getting problems where you have, in our market, derivatives, which are built on sand. And they, in turn, as we've seen with collateralized debt obligations and similar instruments, they become assets that prompt apparent, you know, security in companies. And what happens then is they're not tested against the market. And with the current accounting rules, which is called mark-to-market, you probably know about this, you have to try and work out what the market value of your asset is. And when you test it, it's not worth anything, then suddenly your company is worthless. Okay, so lack of transparency is a bad thing, but it can appear to be a good thing for the individual actors. So I'm going to talk about complex systems with a bit of luck. As I said, I come from a hard science background and a great believer for many years in the ability to explain things rationally by means of models and systems, and in particular fundamental theories. And in these worlds, we have few interactions, little feedback. They're short range, and the response is typically proportional to impetus, i.e. they're called linear systems in the jargon. When you do that, they tend to be, not always, but they tend to be controlled, reductionist. Reductionism is the theory that, you know, the thing you observe is a consequence of the underlying components and a set of rules. They're modelable, that is, you can do models, particularly computer models nowadays, God bless them. They're often near equilibrium, so that means that they've got, when they've got large parts, a lot of components, that those components have satisfied a set of regular behaviors, like you know, the uniform temperature. Now, when those happens, we're typically working in our laboratories, which we connive to be controlled reductionist. We construct vehicles, engineering, or we're dealing with certain parts of science, and there's only certain parts. Even classical dynamics is not fully deterministic in the way we would like it to be. Okay, it's in theory deterministic, but in practice, even the trajectory of rockets is subject to some chaotic things. Chaos is, by the way, simply that close initial conditions diverge exponentially over time as they evolve. So it turns out that the world that we've got very confident with, the world I grew up in the 60s and the 70s, is one that we created and we believe we understood. Now, the problem we face is, of course, the real world isn't like that at all. Financial markets aren't like that, for sure. It turns out, actually, that I'm afraid that life cellular forms are not either. Society and many, many phenomena that we've looked at. And this is a real shock to me. I must say, I always thought, you know, give enough science, give enough monitoring, and we will be able to predict earthquakes. And what Didier said in another book of his, and people have realized, is actually they're not predictable. And this is where your man Cillier, whatever it is, the chap who quoted, is wrong. The characteristic of these systems is they have long-range correlations. And when they have this type of feature, they're called self-organized critical very often. And they will show some emergent scale-free behavior. But don't think all complex systems do that. They don't. Sometimes they do. When they do, we know what the form of it is. It's the ubiquitous power law. And the power law is that law of size versus frequency that is scale invariant. That's why, for instance, in insurance, we have a thing called the Pareto distribution for large loss claims, and indeed, it's scale invariant. And when you get that scale invariance, you're in the area that the complexity science guys call self-organized critical. So let's just have a look at the applications. The problem occurs in complexity, and I'm sorry this is sort of slightly educational, I suppose, but I need to be clear what I mean by complex, complexity science. I don't think there's a complexity theory. I think there are systems that have complex characteristics, which are the ones that aren't the ones that we can understand in the traditional manner. And I think they've got this big characteristic where you've got components, the micro and the macro. They originated typically, by the way, years ago, of course, with the understanding of molecules and how molecules behave together, that they don't behave according to statistical mechanics in the traditional way. But actually, you can now see, whether it's brain science, the World Wide Web, our two areas, biology and financial markets, words, social sciences, business admin, you see the same problem. And the characteristic is that you've got components or agents, and you're trying to look at the overall behavior. And that's why I asked the question I did. How do you think about problems of this type? And the trouble is we've been conditioned to think of them as causal based upon the components. And that, I'm afraid, that model just doesn't seem to work very well. Here's some examples of what are called gene regulatory networks. Now, my background is actually quantum chemistry originally. And I don't know if you know much about the sort of predictability of the behavior of molecules, but I'll just quickly recap. It isn't, I'm afraid, as simple as it seems. So here we're at a level where we think we've got ball and stick molecules, but even to understand how a relatively small molecule behaves computationally is beyond the power, even the conceivable power of computers. These are what are called partial differential equations. Now, classical mechanics is a linear, is a normal differential equation problem, but the underlying quantum mechanics is partial differential. So we're already in an approximation when we talk about ball and stick, DNA and proteins. But even when you do that, the sheer interaction feedback loops to these are horrendous. And here are some examples, and here's another one. You can find them all. They're all like this, pretty much. Even the ones we thought were simple turn out to have all these interacting factors. Here are some quotes from David Orrell's book. David Orrell, by the way, did originally climate science. He's originally from Oxford. But he went into systems biology. And when he went in there, he found the same things that worried him about the climate models. And you should be worried about the climate models. These are, I'm afraid, not computer models that you can have any confidence in at all. So anyone who tells you that they can is wrong. Anyhow, Orrell explains that in his book. He was in the Maths Institute in Oxford, but he also looked at the system biology. You can read these for yourselves. They elude computation. We cannot translate DNA from the bottom up. And that's why, although it's not mathematical, I think Dennis Noble's book is extremely enlightening. I think it's probably the program for our age in terms of understanding the world, is how you deal with this problem of non-computability, i.e. the old models don't work. Now, Didier, in a paper he wrote, actually reflected back on the sort of biotech boom, and he made this comment, and I don't know whether you buy this, but I think this is fair. He's basically saying that anyone who knows anything about science realizes you don't need to be a genius to know that this problem, the expression of genes, is going to be a complex system problem. And the consequence of this was that a lot of asset value was created based upon the belief that the DNA, the human genome, was going to tell you, all your characteristics. So, if you're kind of dumb, you'd look at patents and you'd say, okay, pharmaceuticals, make me money. This is just a large pharmaceutical, isn't it? So let's go and get a patent on it because one of them sometime is going to mean that, I've solved rheumatoid arthritis, which, by the way, might be true, But what we're forgetting is that the underlying physics, the underlying system, is extremely complicated. And therefore, the presumed asset value of these companies was found not to exist. and therefore they fell when the dot-com guys went. Another quote. Oh my God. Ah, right. Now this was interesting because in the New York Times in 2007, you know, the penny dropped. This was based upon a review in Nature, by the way, so there was a proper bit of science behind it. And this is the failure of the what do they call it? The basic principle of the DNA expression into proteins and their outcome. And it turned out that here we are. The patent office has said that's good. So I'm not making, you know, any religious statements about whether patents are good or bad. I happen to personally think they're a good idea because they protect invention. I don't particularly object to chemicals being patented. You know, I don't particularly. What I do worry about is the utility of that patent. And what this is saying is that we may not be able to work out what the relationship is between the thing you patented and its consequence. And this is a really fundamental problem. And let's see, and there's Didier's book. Okay, well, this is some stuff about slightly different. I just wanted to shoot slightly out of sequence. This is about the financial markets crashes. These are quotes, interestingly, made before 1929. You think history doesn't repeat itself. I'm afraid with these types of things, human nature repeats itself, and therefore history repeats itself. But what you see is this blind optimism. Now, what I'd like to point out with these quotes, is I've seen this in my own insurance markets, we've seen it in other financial markets, you've seen it in everyday life. You know, you may have a few loonies on the fringe saying, you know, you're doomed, but actually everyone says it's fine, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine, bang. And then everyone says, well, actually I said it was not fine all along. In fact, people like Didier have been saying it's not been fine all along, but you know what it's like. You don't want to believe it. Governments, regulators, and everyone colludes in this myth. This, I'm afraid, is human behavior, and that's, I think, the added value problem that we've got. If you've got a science that's complex and that muddies the water, you know, the human endeavor is incredibly muddy already, so we're now making it almost impossible to know where you are, and you get this difficulty of knowing how to behave. And this indicates that people can delude themselves. This is what's happened with the house prices. That's what's happened with prices of something or other. So here's my argument. My argument is that we've got underlying a very complex system. The reason that's a problem is that the things that we do to understand that, which is the patents of those components, in themselves, therefore the complexity comes over to there, which relates to the informational problem. Because actually that database problem, I have to say, I've spent, you know, loads of years looking after IT. It isn't a hard problem, okay? The fact they're incompetent, you know, doesn't surprise me, it's governments, but, you know, it isn't a hard problem. But what is hard is if you solve that informational problem, you find it's actually an extremely complex web. So actually showing the interactions and overlaps of those, you know, DNA sequences and the proteins and how they relate, that, I'm afraid, is what will muddy that water. That is what will then muddy that water. And